ladies, gents, friends, folks. On behalf of our college president, Jonathan Mickey, our vice president, Yasmin Khan, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 5th annual Black History Month lecture at Kellogg College. This lecture series started, as I said, it's in its 5th year. It started 5 years ago after the global protests against the brutal murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd ensued. It was a late awakening for us, but it's an awakening we do not wish to go back to the time where we didn't have something to mark the Black History Month. We've had 5 excellent years of the Black History Month exhibition go on at Kellogg College, which marks the history of Black women. And we hope some of you have had some time to look at that exhibition, which has been on for the entire month. But today we'll be having our final Black History Month lecture, and we'll be celebrating that with José Lingna Nafafé from the University of Bristol. I first heard José in 2022 when he delivered the keynote at the Critical Legal Conference in Durham, and it was a moment when the penny dropped that so much of what we had read about the abolitionist movement in at least British history was centered around white men and the 19th century international admiralty codes, which were seen as the first codes to have stopped and tried successfully slave ships which were passing through. And it was seen as this moment where something turned in the history of the abolitionist movement. But that was 19th century. When I first heard José took us back 2 centuries before and said that history of abolitionism doesn't start in Britain at all. It's located elsewhere. So much of what you're actually going to hear today is not going to be about British history, but it's going to be about South American history. It's going to be about European history. But it's important to get that right in order to get British history right, because we're going to be learning about the roots of the abolitionist movement, which go far, far back than what we think and know in this country as the abolitionist movement. So I'm really grateful to José for delivering that lecture, which is based on his award-winning book, which is available at the back if you would like to get a copy of it tonight. In the words of Toby Green, who reviewed that book for the London Review of Books, the book is impressive, it's rare, and it's a testament to Nafafé's years of research in archives in Brazil, Portugal, and the Vatican, and to his detailed understanding of the religious, literary, and ethnographic contexts of the surviving sources. The book is called Black Atlantic Abolitionist Movement in the 17th Century, and it's published by the Cambridge University Press. This lecture, I hope, tempts you to get a copy of the book. But José is going to whet our appetite in the meanwhile. José, you have 35 minutes, and we hope everybody can collect their questions. We'll come back to you for a round of Q&A before we open for some more drinks and festivities afterwards. Please join me in welcoming José for delivering the 5th annual Black History Month lecture.
Thank you very much, Shreya, for that wonderful introduction. I hope you all can hear me. Welcome to this lecture. I hope I'm not going to disappoint you, but we will learn together something about the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade carried out by the African themselves. Long way before Wilberforce, and his contingent colleagues that were fighting for the abolition in Britain at the time. Something I will read, other thing I will talk to you through. I hope you can still bear with me while I'm doing that. Okay, I will also looking at my time very closely so that I won't run over that and so on. On the 6th of March, 1684, Lourenço da Silva Mendonça from the Kingdom of Congo in the Indies, quote, arrived in Rome to take up an important role for black peoples, end of quote. That role was to bring a criminal kafunda. Kafunda here is a case in the Kimbundu language of Angola before the Vatican court, accusing states involved in Atlantic slave trade, including Italy, Spain, Portugal, and the Curia, the Vatican itself. What is today called the Vatican? Of committing crimes against enslaved Africans that today would undoubtedly constitute crimes against humanity. It detailed, quote, tyrannical sale of human beings, the diabolical abuse of this kind of slavery which they committed against any divine or human law, end of quote. Mendonça, a member of the Ndongo royal family, ruler of Pedras, which is stones in Portuguese, of Pungandongo, situated in what is now modern Angola. He carried with him the hopes of the enslaved Africans and the other oppressed group in what was a remarkable moment that I would argue challenges the established interpretation of the history of slavery. In the Anglophone literature, debate on enslaved African people experiences and the abolition of Atlantic slavery has largely been dominated by the US historian, whose work is often geographically focused on the US, the Caribbean, the Anglophone Africa, and temporarily limited to the 18th and 19th century. Much less attention has been paid to Lusophone Africa, countries colonized by the Portuguese, Brazil, Portugal, and then we then can include in that equation Spain and the Vatican, which leaves a huge gap in knowledge on the history of slavery and the abolition. In particular, the almost exclusive focus on the 18th, 19th century Euro-American debate on the abolition overlooks the early abolition debate that took place in the Lusophone Atlantic in the 17th century. Mendonça's writing on freedom are distinguished by their holistic engagement with themes of life, death, abolition, and reparations. Researches in Mendonça's court case help us gain a deeper understanding of the transatlantic slave trade, showing Africa, the slave trade, abolition, and reparations in a complete new light. Legal, moral, ethical, and political debate on the abolition of slavery has traditionally been understood to have been initiated by Europeans in the 18th century. Figures such as Thomas Braxton, Thomas Claxton, Granville Sharp, David Livingstone, and William Wilberforce, to the extent that Africans are recognized as having played any role in ending slavery, specifically in the 17th century, their efforts are typically confined to sporadic and impulsive cases of resistance involving shipboard revolts, maroon communities, individual fugitive slaves, and household revolts. Studies of these cases have never gone beyond the obvious economic disruption caused by the enslaved people, resulting to poisoning, murder, and attacks on plantations and their masters' household properties. Even those enslaved Africans, such as Alaura Kuyanu, Otoba Kwakuanu, who gained their freedom through the sheer endeavor and subsequently argued in the strongest term for the abolition of slavery in the 18th and 19th century, were seen as limited in scope, without international impact, and reliant on their European counterparts. Curiously, to date, no historian of slavery of West Africa, Africans or Africanists, abolitionists, in this case, Atlanticists, have researched the Black Atlantic abolition movement in the 17th century. Those who have attempted to engage with that debate often concluded that any action driven by Africans was a localized endeavor. No historian has yet produced an in-depth study of highly organized, international scale legal code for liberation and abolition spearheaded by Lourenço da Silva Mendonça. As Mendonça called it, quote, complaints. Complaints about slavery and the other issues that follow from there. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about who was Mendonça and his education. As I said, Mendonça came from Pungandongo, what is today modern Angola. He was born in the kingdom of Pungandongo, as we have seen, probably in 1690 or 1649 in Angola. His place of death remained unknown. His birth coincided with Portugal tightening up its grip on the slave trade in West Central Africa. This trade brutally affected and defined his early childhood and adulthood. Mendonça's grandfather, King Philip, or Harry I, was the first Angolan allied to the King of Portugal after being conquered. I will come to explain that in a minute, what this means. Angola was named after the title of its king, which was Angola. Harry I had to fight wars as a conquered king alongside the Portuguese troop against other Angolans, with two of his sons, including Mendonça's father, Inácio da Silva, and Francisco, heir to the throne. Francisco ended up dying fighting alongside Portugal to liberate Angola from the Dutch. For 38 years, Harry was compelled to provide the Portuguese crown a tax of 100 enslaved persons per year, a tax known as baculamento in the Kimbundu language of Angola. He was forced to provide 3,800 enslaved people to the crown, because the period from which he ruled Pungandongo was 38 years. Mathematically, if he was faithful in paying 100 enslaved persons per year, then he would have paid 3,800 people to the Portuguese crown. That was one man alone. Imagine how many rulers that were conquered in Angola in the period following. They were running to 300, 400, or even more people that were conquered. That mathematics, I will leave that to you to sum it up. He was forced to provide 300 or 3,800 people to the crown. Harry II, Mendonça's uncle, a graduate from the Jesuit College in Angola, became a king in 1664 after Harry's passing. Harry II refused to pay 100 enslaved persons per year, leading the Portuguese crown to declare war on his kingdom in 1671. Harry I was captured and was killed, and his head was brought to Portugal. Mendonça, along with his uncles, aunties, and brothers, protested against the Portuguese and refused to provide a tax on the enslaved Angolan. As a result, they were exiled in Brazil. In the 16th and 17th century, Portugal was the far front of European maritime empires. Angola, from 1585, Luanda, a modern-day capital, was established, a port south of the kingdom, in the kingdom of Ongandongo, to serve that particular trade. Lourenço da Silva took his father's surname to become Lourenço da Silva Mendonça, or in the Portuguese, E here standing as and to his father, and possibly some might say his uncle, and so on. So Mendonça, in 1673, Mendonça was taken to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro to Rio, but first to Salvador and then later to Rio de Janeiro. We'll see that in a minute in the drawing that I have done. After spending 2 years in Brazil, Mendonça then was sent back to Portugal. The King of Portugal decided that these prince and princesses that were sent to Brazil should not return to Angola because of the war that took place and the brutal killing of their uncle. As a result of that, the King of Portugal decided that they should all be sent to Portugal. Mendonça was sent to Braga, the north of Portugal. There he studied for 4 to 5 years, including law. And then after that, Mendonça returned to Lisbon, where he was elected a member of the confraternity, a member who was also part of the internal organization of the confraternity of Black Christians in Portugal. The confraternities here were the guilds of Black Christians that the Portuguese created in most of their ruling or region that they were conquered, that they conquered at the time. You would find the confraternities of Black Christian in Congo, the confraternity of Black Christian in São Tomé and Príncipe. You find confraternity of Black Christian in Cape Verde, São Tomé, as well as what today we call Guinea-Bissau. These were places where they established these so-called Black Christian guilds before they were set in Brazil. Those guilds too had also a constitution. That constitution was drawn legally. The same constitution ruled or governed all of those confraternities that you would find in Lisbon, you would find in São Tomé, you would find Angola, you would find in Congo, you would find in Cape Verde, and so on. So Mendonça spent his early years in Lisbon, where he studied, and then from there he was appointed an attorney for Black Christian in Lisbon. That position of being appointed as an attorney for Black Christian within the constitution that was given to the confraternities, Mendonça gathered evidence that was necessary for him to go to the Vatican to present the case. In 1682, Mendonça left. He went to Toledo, went to the court of Toledo in Madrid. There he stayed for 18 months. After that, he was supported by Carlos II, Archbishop of Toledo, and another contingent group in the court of Madrid. From that time, Mendonça gathered all of that information, went to the Vatican and presented his case. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides, which I think would be very important to accompany our talk here. The letter that Mendonça took from the confraternities of Christians in Lisbon, but in particular from the ambassador of Vatican or Curia in Lisbon, that letter contained a coat of arms under that letter that he carried with him. But the letter also has this inscription, which you can see here in the Spanish language. It says, morir es lo más cierto. The complete phrase we have in Latin is mors certa es ad eos ora incerta es. Death is certain, but the hour is not known. But what we find, that is the complete dictum in Latin. In the letter that Mendonça carried with him, they did not include ad eos ora incerta es. In other words, the certainty or the uncertainty of death for the African in the Atlantic did not need a prediction. It was happening daily to the African. That death also is not what you may call a natural death. Because very often, if death is what we think it is, death is certain, we all know we are dying. And when we hear that phrase, death is certain, it sounds like a natural death. But the reality is, the death that Mendonça is talking about here is a death induced, not a natural death. This is a death that are being caused by reckless people who were carrying the African to the Atlantic, and so on. So very often I think sometimes, have I just translated that word correctly? Death is certain. Because what is happening here is not the death, as I said, as we know. Maybe we may have to change that translation and say murder is certain, rather than death. Because death might take away our mind to think that it is natural death that Mendonça was talking about. The other thing that is very important in the understanding the history of Atlantic, very often what we get from the standard textbook is this: Africans have been participant in the slave trade. That is what we're being taught. My first book, monograph, was written based on that understanding, that Africans were participating in the slave trade. But the reality is, with new evidence that I have found, which none of the historians 100 years ago, even now, who have written about the slavery in Africa, the Atlantic slave trade, have not talked about that document. I will come back to that in a minute. But just for us, for our understanding here, to understand slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, Africans that were viewed as people who were part of what we call participating, or so-called collaborators in some other places, were African who were conquered. I hope we understand that. African who were conquered by the Europeans, be that by French, the Portuguese, the English, and the Dutch, and others you might want to think about. But in that conquering, too, they have to swear upon an oath of what their conqueror wanted them to do. So what we have here is a document called an Unda, which appeared in 1666. But that document, I would say, is older. Just simply because it emerged in the 17th century doesn't necessarily mean that the practice is new. All the conquered African rulers have to swear upon those principles that are summarized here. You have to pay 100 enslaved persons per year as a conquered ruler. Second, you also is obliged to have a faith which is Catholic. Otherwise, you cannot continue to be a ruler. You have to accept the Catholic faith. Second, you have to acknowledge the King of Portugal, be that the King of England or Spain. You have to acknowledge them as your only king. You are a conquered person. That is your obligation. All your natural resources should also belong to the king who conquered you. But fundamentally, you also have to allow men of war to be recruited from the very region where you are a king. These men of war would have to fight alongside the contingent force from the conquered king who conquered you. To fight whom? You have to fight your own brothers and sisters, your neighbors. You also have to open your region for the market. The Portuguese would have to trade without paying any tax in that very region. You also have to return any enslaved person that might have been captured. If that person ran away, you have to find them and return them to their captive, or the person who captured them. And the rules goes on. And finally, you also cannot wage war on other people, rulers who were conquered by the Portuguese. So this is something fundamental. When we read about history of slavery, African slavery participating, we don't get this. Because the assumption is African willy-nilly accepted it. Not necessarily. I have challenged people, I said, show me an African ruler who was not conquered that participated in the slave trade. Think. Find one. We can think about it. But all the African, this is your chapter of an oath which you have to swear upon. Right? I feel now like I'm preaching. Have they participated? Have they collaborated under all of those rules? Because if you don't do it, your fate will be in the hand of your conqueror. Mendonça's grandfather, before he died, he was asked to pay those 100 enslaved persons. Through the years, he said, no, this is not how you treat a king. I can't continue to pay these 100 enslaved persons per year. Portugal said, no, this is your oath. You have to do it. His children came in, and they rebelled against it. What happened? War was waged upon them. Harry II was killed. His head was taken to Portugal. This is the price. If you do not abide to the rules, that is what would follow. Places after places. Look at what happened in other regions of Africa. Be that the British, be that French. If you rebelled against the system, then you have to pay it with your own body. Or either you are taken as enslaved or something else happened. So we have to ask the question, did the African participate as we are being told, or they were forced to? But this is still going on today. You even have African, they will sing to you, oh, African collaborated. They were the collaborators, they would say to you. Under what understanding? We are not understanding the dynamic of the enslaved African in the Atlantic slave trade period. I've spent a lot of time there. I think we have to move on because I think it's very important. My thing is get stuck. Can we move this now? No. Right, okay, let's try it. Right, okay. So this is the tax system that Fernão de Souza, that I was saying, no historian has mentioned this. Colleagues who have researched history of Atlantic in Angola, Congo, before me, I don't know whether they've seen the document or they haven't seen it, but they have not mentioned it. Fernão de Souza said, all African rulers conquered would have to pay 100 enslaved persons per year. And not only that, this is going to be a tax for generations to come. So the African that we found in the 18th, 19th century, they're doing precisely because this has now been naturalized and so on. For many who were not able to pay what was happening, they were paying with their children, old wives, or children and wives and so on and so forth. This was the kingdom from where Mendonça was coming from. It was destroyed in 1671. It is now a site in Angola as a UNESCO site. Mendonça, as I said, Mendonça's grandfather paid that number. What also we don't understand very often, that is not talked about in the Atlantic slave trade, is that there is a tax that has to be paid for the king of that particular empire, be that the British Empire, the French, Italian in this case, the Portuguese, or the Spaniard. Every single enslaved that left shore of Africa to the Atlantic, the king of England, be that the king of Portugal, get 20% of the sale, which is 1/5. It is called the standard tax. So the system was there. So Mendonça came from Pungandongo, as I said, traveled to Brazil, and from there, in Brazil, he then was sent to Portugal. Portugal, he traveled to Madrid to Rome. What did he do? He ended up in the Propaganda Fide. The place here. This is where Mendonça presented the case in Rome. Propaganda Fide is a tribunal, like other tribunal, the Overseas Council in Portugal, or the Council of Indies, and so on. This is where he presented the case. But what was the reason for Mendonça to go to the Vatican? Mendonça went to the Vatican because in the 15th century, mid-15th century, there were many bulls that were being passed on by different popes. Those bulls were given to the kings of Spain as well as Portugal. What were the bulls about? The bulls were about enslaving the African. I'll pause here for a little bit. You can read that for yourself, what the bull says. But this bull did not just come from the Pope because the Pope decided, oh, well, I'm going to give you the bulls. It was the Iberian kings, Portugal in particular, that asked for the monopoly of Africa to give them the right to enslave African. As a result of that, the bull emerged. People come to me and say very often, what Pope and what power did the Pope have at that time? Of course, they did have the power. And this is what we got to understand. That bull was passed on because Pope has given his stamp to it in order to allow Portugal and Spain, and most European states have followed that. That all African can be captured if they did not accept Christianity. But the reality was, Africans were accepting Christianity. But even that, they were continue to be captured and enslaved. This was the reason for Mendonça to go to the Vatican. Mendonça said crime were being committed. Africans were being captured, boys and girls, and mothers were to be sold to Christian merchants, who then sell them to other European akin to animals. Hunting the African as one would hunt an animal to get them in order to sell them. This was what the transatlantic slave trade was about. People say participation. What participation? We'll see that in a minute, if we have the time. So Mendonça presented the case. Slavery, as I said to you earlier, if you look at that bull by Pope Nicholas, it was a legal document. For Mendonça to overturn the transatlantic slave trade, he had to use legal argument to overturn it. The first thing Mendonça did, he presented the case. He said slavery was practiced against human law. It was wrong. Usano contra ogni legge humana. They practice it against human law. What is human law? The very law that says we all have a right to live. Every human being has the right to live. No one has the right to capture somebody else. In the understanding, our duty of care to each human person is there present in the human law. But that is already pushed aside in the Atlantic. Mendonça said slavery was wrong because it was practiced against natural law. What natural law says? Natural law says every human being born of a woman is free. Be that an African, be that European, be that Asian, be that of indigenous American. By natural law, we are free, but that has not been followed in the Atlantic. Usano contra ogni legge naturale. Mendonça said slavery was practiced against divine law. The very law, the creator who created natural human law, his law also is being abrogated. Divine law talked about principles of our humanity. God created us in his own image. Everybody is a human being. Lastly, Mendonça said slavery was practiced against civil law. So he challenged the Pope Innocent XI to take a decision, and that decision was meant that slavery should be abolished immediately, unless there is other condition. That might be that somebody might have been captured legally. But from the document we have, from this period, even earlier period, there was no legality of capturing African in the African shores. We have a judge from Madrid. When Congo was complaining, a judge was sent, Fazardo, in 1623 to Angola, Congo, to investigate how Africans were being captured. He carried out his investigation in the region. The document he wrote was running to more than 35 pages. His conclusion, there was no slave in Congo and Angola. There was no just war, he said. All of those wars were being invented by the settlers in Luanda who wanted to capture the African. I will move very quickly because the time might be running out. How many do I still have? 10 minutes. Okay, that's very generous. Thank you. Mendonça said, finish slavery immediately. But if there are cases in which there is a just war where Africans are being captured, then leave them as enslaved only for 7 years, not more than that. But that didn't happen. What Mendonça was referring to was the case of the French, where the indentured labor, after being serving in the Atlantic at that time, in the Caribbean, would be set free after serving for 3.5 years. But Mendonça said 7 years, that would be enough. At the time when Mendonça was presenting his case to within the congregations of Black Christian Brotherhood, women, young people, men were writing to the Vatican to say, our case is being presented, what is happening? The court case took 2 years for the Vatican to decide. I finished the book by saying the Vatican decided. Portugal was asked to abolish slavery, and so was Spain, but they end up ameliorating the condition of the shipment of the enslaved. They did not go along with abolishing slavery. That is how I end up the book. I said there was a battle internally within the congregation of the Council of Indies that was counseling the king, as well as the Overseas Council in Portugal, and so on. What I didn't see in all the research was the very verdict that the Vatican pronounced on the case. That is what we're going to be looking at now in the next 5 minutes. Sit back, have a look at it. This very verdict was sent from the propaganda fide, the first court, because they had doubt, they wanted clarification from the higher court of the Holy Office and so on. The Holy Office decided and they look at the case and they gave their response. This is the original version that was sent from Propaganda Fide. It is written in Italian. I have not translated it, time wasn't enough. I have, here the transcriptions of it. I did not translate it. But what is very important, one of the words that are being used in Latin, in defesos, is the Italian that is translated, benché non danneggiano nessuno. In other words, somebody who did not harm anyone. Is it legal to capture African or to capture enslaved who did not harm anyone? That was the doubt being sent. The Vatican looked at all of these things and then they responded. That is the translation. I have found or returned to the Vatican, to the Propaganda Fide, to the Holy Office. That is the translation of the document in Italian, the rough translation of it into Latin. Here we have the cleaner version of it, but without response of the translation from the Italian into Latin. When Pope Innocent XI put together his own legal team, this special congregation, for a particular congregation, as they were called, including cardinals, lawyers, and so on, they come to decision. We now have the decision of the verdict that was being translated. And you can see the response, even the emphasizing by underlying. Can you see the underlying? There, in all of that. But what was it? This is what's now after the decision being taken on the 20th of March, 1686. This has been written in full and published in Decretum. Decretum is a decree, law, and so on. So that is the version that is being published, and this is the version I have now attempted to translate with the translation of many colleagues and so on. So the Holy Office, the Supreme Court of Christendom, decided that slavery was illegal. What language we want to use here? I have it translated into Latin, English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, Italian, German, Swedish, Kiswahili, Kimbundu, and Guarani, which is the native language of Brazilian. But let's just feel comfortable with English for the time being. Okay? Is it lawful to violently, to deceitfully capture black as well as other defenseless, which is the word I was saying to you. The word defenseless here means a person who harmed no one. Look at the response from the Holy Office, from the Vatican. Can you see that? Maybe you can't see it because of the thing. I'll read it out for you. Your Eminency said it is unlawful. The first proposition, it is unlawful to capture the Africans. It is illegal. So in other words, slavery should have been abolished on the 20th of March, 1686. Second proposition, could you help me read it? Is it lawful to sell and make other contracts about blacks and other defenseless, here again the word people who did not harm anyone, taken captive by force or deceit? Your Eminency said it is unlawful to do it. Are we still here? That is the verdict. It was illegal in the 17th century. Slavery should have been abolished then, and so on. And we have these propositions. What were the contracts? Contracts were being given to people to go and buy and sell the African. These were merchants. Mendonça said they were the one capturing, and so on. Proposition 4. buyers of black as well as other heathens, are they not bound to inquire into the title of their servitude, whether they have been justly or unjustly made slaves? Is it lawful when many of these have been unjustly taken captive? The big question at this moment in time, earlier in the 16th century as well as 17th century, the merchants who were going to Africa, some who were in direct contact with the people they were buying, others are buying them from the second hand, and so on, from other merchants. Many of them were in doubt about the people that they were buying. They returned to Europe, they returned to Seville, they returned to Lisbon. They were asking priests, lawyers, could you help us understand whether we should continue to buy these people? The School of Salamanca, which was the legal school at that time established in Spain to deal with many other issues to do with overseas and other legal laws at the time, have said to many of the merchants, you don't need to inquire about the title. If you don't know, just buy. But here what we find is the Vatican said, Your Eminence said, you are obliged to inquire. I want to move very quickly because I know we haven't got the time. I want you to look at the preposition 6. Can we read it from there?
Are not the buyers of black and other defenseless heathens who have been made slaves by violence and trickery, both the buyers and their masters, bound to compensate them for damages?
Yeah. Are the buyers, the sellers, are bound to compensate them for the damages? We are talking about reparation. Your Eminence said they are obliged. We are in the heart of England. We know what happened to the merchant that were buying Africans. They were compensated. Are we still here? Africans have not. Portugal was compensated. Spain was compensated. France was compensated. But where is the compensation for the African? That damage was caused directly to them. Why? They did not harm anyone. The Angolan, Ghanaian, Nigerian, Bissau Guinean didn't come to Britain to attack Britain. They didn't go to Portugal to attack Portugal. They didn't harm any European. So the law here has said, those who did not harm anyone, why capture them and sell them as enslaved? Now I'm preaching. The law said, you cannot do it. I'm not going to conclude, but I just want to show you something that emerged before we finish. I'll return to the Vatican. I have researched, I found more new document about the case of Mendonça. What has been happening? The 11 propositions did not finish in the 17th century. The Capuchin missionaries continued to re-invoke the verdict. In 1711, they brought it back to the table. Why? Because of continuation of the enslaved Africans. Discussion between the missionaries in Africa, Angola, and Brazil, asking the question, why is slavery continuing? There were already announcement or verdict which says you shouldn't. In 1739, that verdict was brought back again. In 1741, the verdict was brought back into discussion. In 1794, closer now to Wilberforce, discussion it was brought. In 1794, the verdict was discussed in conjunction with Britain as well as Danish abolitionism. The African abolition, they argued, was older. Abolition have finished a long time ago. British abolition, they said, was dangerous. Dangerous because they were talking about abolition, but at the same time, many Africans were continued to be enslaved at that time. We are going to stop it here. I leave you with a question. Where are we with the compensation? Where are we with injustice that being done to the African? The European legal people have argued that it was legal at the time when slavery was being practiced. No. From 1686, it became illegal. I'll leave Sharia to answer that question.
Thank you, Jose. It's interesting to be reminded time to time that even the Vatican gets some things wrong or some things right at other points. Thank you so much for providing that corrective and for decentering the UK and the US from the abolitionist history. Thank you so much. I wonder if we can have a round of questions from the audience. If you can wave at me, we'll get a mic to you. If you could introduce yourself and be as brief as possible, be fantastic. If we can take a round, if there are some burning questions in the audience. Joy.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot. Just one question. Something that comes up a lot is where people say, this happened such a long time ago. It has nothing to do with me. It's my previous relatives. And therefore, let's not look to the past. What is your answer to that in terms of reparations? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Sarah, there's another one right there. And then Patricia. We'll take those three.
Hello, I'm Edward Millard. I'm a student here at Kellogg College. My question is this, that, you said it was illegal because these documents that you have found were written by the papal court. Now, what actual legal power did the papal court have vis-a-vis the countries that were practicing the slave trade and their legal positions on this?
I think my question is very similar to the last one with regards to Britain, especially. Did the Court of Rome have any influence in, post Henry VIII in England? And then the other question was about, there was a reference to people who were not causing harm. And obviously, if you capture people in battle, that you could argue that they were causing harm. So was that a get-out clause? And have you explored that? And was it used by the merchants in any way to justify the continuation of the trade?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, very good question. I hope I will answer them correctly. The first one is about it happened a long time ago. What that has to do with us now? Of course, it has to do with us now. The legacy of the slave trade continues until today. The very reason we have legislations about the ethnic minority and the others and so on, it goes back to that particular period. The colonial chapter, after the independence of Africa, people are coming, all of that feed back into this. But the other question, much more pertinent, is the Atlantic slave trade. Britain paid their merchant until a couple of years ago. So they didn't pay them compensation in that very period. They pay them, they just finished paying them. France called upon Haiti for rebelling, for gaining independence. Haiti paid France for losing its property. That was Haiti. So that was paid until recently. So what we are talking about here, the legality or illegality of the slave trade, continue to exist. Even though when we talk about Britain, which is very much what the Vatican was talking about at the time, the British abolition, what did the British do really in terms of abolition? In some cases, they bullied other nations to stop buying African. The Portuguese in the region today we call Guinea-Bissau, Britain has said to Portugal, you are not going to trade in cacao for a period of 50 years, but we are going to pay you compensation for that. So the compensation is just beginning, because one chapter is close to the people who actually bought people as a property, which they believe where they were doing legally, but the legality of it is here. We now see it. We now can talk about it. I take the second question, which is the court of the Vatican, what power did they have? We could ask the question, what power did Britain have at the time? Who gave Britain the power to abolish slavery? Did they have the jurisdiction of other regions? Maybe not. But go back to that legality. Mendonça went to the Vatican because the previous Pope allowed Portugal. The legality was there. If without the Pope, Portugal didn't have any monopoly of Africa. So this is why Mendonça was arguing. Your previous, your predecessors were the one giving this legality to nations. In that legality to nations, in 1455, Britain was still under Catholicism. Henry VIII was not anywhere near there. So they benefited from it. We cannot look at it from when England separated from Catholicism, but even there, then still, not the entire country. We still have Catholicism until today, since then. Section and so on, but the rulers, of course, have taken a different step. So my answer to that is, the first ruling, Britain was part of it. I have argued very strongly in the book that the transatlantic slave trade was a European project. It didn't matter whether the center was in Lisbon, as it was, because the Pope gave the foundation. The center then later on moved to Spain because the union of the two crowns from 1580. It didn't matter because what we find in the Atlantic, the British merchant, the German merchant, the Dutch merchant, the Danish merchant, Swedish merchant were all part of it. Italian merchant were all part. So this is not a project where we can separate nations. As we now separated, we are not under the rule. They may not be under the rule from Henry VIII, but this ruling has gone beyond Henry VIII. So this is where legality. I'm not a lawyer. I studied law very little when I was doing my PhD. I thought I could. But then I realized it was not going to be possible. I wasn't going to have my own PhD even to finish my degree of law. I studied, like when you go to do legal studies in Britain, you study law of tort, you study the constitutions, you study family law and all of that. That is as far as I can go. But what we can see here is that legality has gone beyond Britain, breaking away from so on. Your question, Patricia, I think, I don't know whether I can answer it in full, but this is precisely the point. It was not by innocent that phrase, which is being translated in the Ephesus in Latin. Why is that question coming in? It's because there was a discussion that when just war is a just war, people can be captured. But what is the concept of just war? Just war says, if somebody has attacked you or taken your property away, you have the right to attack them as a result of that, in a much more simplistic way. In other words, somebody attacked you, you then can defend yourself. But what we find in Africa, as I was saying to you, in a general sense, the African, the Nigerian, the South Guinean didn't come to attack Britain. That is the first illegality. Just war were also justified in every captaincies that were created by European. They had their war cabinets. The Portuguese had their war cabinets in Angola. But this war cabinet did not include the African. In other words, this war cabinet can decide when war were to take place and when not to take place. From the judge I just mentioned to you, this was a judge sent by Madrid because Congo was saying there was a lot of illegality here. His conclusion, as I said, he said there was no just war. All the wars were being forced by the merchant because they want to capture. So we have to think about this, that the African were at the receiving end of slavery. And also this is where the question comes into the idea that there was participation. What we are missing is that conquered region by the European become the participant, but they were under duress of European. They were not doing it because for the sake of doing it. The question I ask, if slavery was natural to Africa, why were the Africans running away from it? Why? Why would you run for something so normal to you? Africans then were viewed as being cannibalists. For that reason, they need to be captured. Hey, cannibalism, when they end up in America, they didn't want to eat the native. In other words, their cannibalism finished. How was something that was part of your menu end up not being part of it in the America? They took other food with them, but not the human being meat that they said the African were doing. So this concept of understanding that African were at war with European, no, the European wages war on African territory. That is what the bulls are saying. The bull we've seen there from Paul Nicholas II, you can wage war on them if they did not accept Christianity. But that was illegal. This is what Mendonça was talking about. It is illegal, you can't do it because of natural law, because of divine law, because of civil law, because of other laws. I hope I have not taken all the time to respond to your question, but I think that question is a very important question. They're being asked repeatedly what jurisdiction the Pope had at that time. Of course they did. As they did in 16th century, they did have in the 17th century. What the priest, Capuchin priest at that time, said Pope cannot stay away from what was happening. There is a legal obligation. Kings of Spain, Spain was considered a kingdom of Christianity. Who is the head of Christianity as we know it historically? The Pope. In other words, the king was responsible to the Pope. Pope was responsible to the king were responsible to their governors overseas. So in other words, there is a chain of responsibility that runs through back to the Pope and as well as to the governors overseas and so on. So that jurisdiction would need to be looked at. But we need to look at it as a whole of understanding that slavery, the Atlantic slavery, was a European project.
Thank you, Jose. I have a final question for you from Naz Kanenas. You're getting the mic in a second.
Thank you very much, Jose. It's disturbing, fascinating. So we have the verdicts. They're repeated over 140 years. They're definitive. To what extent were they pursued? Did the Vatican follow up on this? Was it as active as other verdicts were being pursued? Were they left on the books and purposefully not shared? Could you tell us a little bit more about that before we read the book? Thank you.
Yeah, the verdict I have to say is not in the book, but this is something else to come because it's a new research and so on. Cambridge I contacted them immediately after all of this. They said, would you like another book? Yes, I would like another book, but that might take another 2 or 3 more years to write based on this, because these are documents in the language that need to be transcribed. No, the missionaries were taking this very, very seriously. The Capuchin missionaries, they were the one taking it, challenging. In some cases, they were refusing to give mass to the merchant, because they're saying, we know and you know that the people you are buying, you're not buying them from legal side of things. It is illegal. So what they were doing, they were refusing to do that. The authority were challenging some of those missionaries who were speaking out, who wanted to say, these things is here to stay with us. So there is that continuity with it. But if we were to think more about it, going back to the question about the jurisdiction, the King of Spain in 1685, Carlos II, the one who supported Mendonça, asked his councils, the Council of Indies, is there any reason to keep slavery in the Atlantic? Find out from your judges, find out from your theologians, find out from your philosophers, what have they said about this issue? The Council of Indies took them time, like any other issue, to respond. They said, we can't abolish slavery now because it's part of the economy. The Spaniards who are in the Indies are not doing any work. Who is doing it is the African. The mining, who is doing it is African. Also, politically, if we were to set these Africans free, the Council of Indies said, they are the majority in the Americas. They will be the leaders of the Americas, not us. So there are obstacles from which the Atlantic world, the same answer you find also from the Portuguese side. Slavery can't be abolished. This is why it lasted for that very long, but not because it was done in innocent. It was known, but the authority didn't. Who propagated the first bull of the 1450? That bull would have stayed in the Vatican if it wasn't the Portuguese king making it available, if it wasn't the Spanish king making it available with their missionaries at the time. They were the one that made this possible. In other words, the kings were the hands and the feet of the Vatican. If they didn't do it, the Vatican didn't have the police in Angola. The Vatican didn't have lawyers circulating in Brazil. This is the very reason, in my understanding, the verdict was set upon simply because the rulers didn't want to do it. It's not of their interest. The first one, the first bull, was of their interest. Every European nation followed that strictly. The Dutch, when they took over Angola in the 17th century, they were doing the same thing. They were capturing Africans. So what we see in here is this progressive force that maintained the slavery. If slavery was one nation jurisdiction, slavery would have finished a long time ago, because it was a European project. For that very reason, it lasted until the time we know it. Okay, thank you.
Jose, the first thing you've corrected for us today is that the Atlantic slave trade was not only wrong, but abolished in the 17th century. And in law schools, we learned that even unenforced and unimplemented law is law. And I hope everyone takes home the right history of the abolitionist movement. The second thing we can correct is we're standing between the drinks and everyone else. But before we get to that, could everyone join me in thanking Jose for this excellent 5th annual Black